This is Research Like a Pro 269, Gone Too Soon, Mary Margaret Peterson Creer. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hello, everybody. Welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you today?
Really good. How about you?
I'm doing well. I thought I would share a new book that I'm reading, which has been so interesting. It's titled The American Farmer in the 18th Century, A Social and Cultural History. It's by Richard L. Bushman, and I've read some of his other work before, so when I saw this, I knew I had to get it. I think it was actually discussed in one of the Institute classes I took a while back, and I ordered it, and it's been sitting on my shelf, so I decided to get it out and just start reading a little bit here and there. So here's what the Amazon blurb says about this book to give you an idea. In the 18th century, 3/4 of Americans made their living from farms. This authoritative history explores the lives, cultures, and societies of America's farmers from colonial times through the founding of the nation. Noted historian Richard Bushman explains how all farmers sought to provision themselves while still actively engaged in trade, making both subsistence and commerce vital to farm economies of all sizes. The book describes the tragic effects on the native population of farmers' efforts to provide farms for their children and examines how climate created the divide between the free North and the slave South. Bushman also traces mid-century rural violence back to the century's population explosion. An engaging work of historical scholarship, the book draws on a wealth of diaries, letters, and other writings, including the farm papers of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, to open a window on the men, women, and children who worked the land in early America.
Ooh, wow, that sounds great. And I have loved Richard Bushman's other work too. He's a great historian.
And he's very readable. It is interesting, it keeps your attention. It's a great resource. So if anybody else has a farm family, I would give a shout out to the book. And of course, almost everybody was a farm family. Do we have anybody in our family history who wasn't a farmer back in the day? Well, on my southern lines, the English lines, we had some miners who, mined in England and some other occupations, but lots of farmers. Our announcements for this week: we have our Airtable Quick Reference Guide available in PDF download on our website, and we've had so many good comments from people who have used that to learn how to use Airtable, and they're just loving it. We also have our Research Like a Pro webinar series for 2023 ongoing. We're excited to hear from Heidi Mathis on Saturday, September 23rd at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. She will be discussing her ancestor, Burkhard Schlag, and she's titled this A Mid-19th Century German Case with Indirect Evidence. Her description is, who were the parents of Burkhard Schlag, a mid-19th century German immigrant? Indirect documentary evidence points to parents. Does DNA evidence support this hypothesis? So the really fun thing that goes with all of our webinars, we have reports from the actual presenter on the research they did. So we've also been getting some great feedback on people really appreciating seeing how someone writes up their research in a report, and especially if it has DNA with it, how the DNA is integrated into the report. So if you're interested, you can certainly still join us for that webinar series, and we have recordings of all the past ones in the year. You could do some catch up. As always, join our newsletter for coupons and to get the links to our latest blogs and podcasts and learn what's going on with us. And then we have some fun conferences coming up this fall. We've got the Utah Genealogical Association Summit of Excellence. That's 22 and 23 September. This is all virtual and several interesting classes per track. So I'll be teaching about pre-1850 census and ethnicity estimates and locality research in your DNA work. And then for the East Coast Genetic Genealogy Conference, Nicole and I are both doing on-demand lectures. So I'll be talking about pedigree triangulation, and Nicole will be discussing how to confirm an ancestral line. And then we will be in person and together for the Professional Management Conference by the Association of Professional Genealogists. And we have a fun class we'll be teaching together, how to incorporate multiple income streams to increase your company's revenue. And then I will be doing a live stream class, creating user-friendly client reports that incorporate DNA analysis. So we're really looking forward to the fall and these conferences and just really enjoying being with all of you.
Our listener spotlight today is from Janet in Connecticut. She says, I just listened to your Shoot 'em Up Dick podcast, which I enjoyed a lot. I was wondering, with two living Williams, if it was part of a German naming tradition where the first name was the church name and the second was the family name, which the child usually went by. In my case, it made some searching very confusing. I wonder if the first William was ever called Henderson. Of course, it could just be one or both parents just loved the name. So enjoy the podcast. Thank you, Janet, for that. And it was fun to consider that possibility when you sent that in. What are your thoughts on that, Diana?
Well, I love that idea. I had never even thought of that. This family was pretty far removed from their German roots, but, maybe that was the case. I'm so curious about that now. So I just wanted to look at the names of the other male children in this family. So we have William was the oldest, and then there's a son named Martin, and he always went by Martin. And then there was a Francis, and then a John Monroe, and then, William Dick Schultz. So I don't know. It's possible. I'm not sure if Francis was a German church name. Martin, I don't know. I think that's an interesting idea, though.
I remember earlier in the Schultz family, the more German ones, they all were named Johann something. Johann Martin, Johann whatever.
Yep.
Interesting. And then William Henderson, I don't know that we know if he ever went by Henderson.
Well, his daughter was named Henderson, and she was the child that was born after he died, and so they named her after him, and she always went by Henderson. And looking at the records, he really went by W.H. a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We really saw just initials. However, the 1880 census does have him as William H. Schultz, but the census records can be different things, and he is William in the censuses with his family.
What about his father, Hickman Monroe Schultz? Did he go by Hickman or Monroe?
He went by Monroe or H.M.
So he went by his middle name. That's interesting.
Yeah, but there is something that has him as Hickman, because I would not have made that one up. That's kind of an interesting name, and it's not a family name, so I have no idea where that one came from.
Yeah, I was looking at his sources, Hickman Monroe. He went by Monroe in almost everything, but then here on this Texas land title, he went by Hickman M.
Right, maybe he felt like that he wanted to be very proper there, because even on his marriage record, he's Monroe, or it actually kind of looks like Monore, like there was a misspelling.
And then let's see, who else in the Schultz line went by their middle name? Your grandpa?
Charles Leslie, yes, he went by Leslie.
And what about William Houston?
William Houston, I saw him also a lot as W.H. That's a good question. Let's see what he is in the records.
I'm looking now, in 1900 he was Houston Schultz.
Yeah, he probably was a mix.
Also William H. in a lot of these, and W.H.
Yeah, I only heard everybody talk about him as Grandpa Schultz. So I really don't have letters or anything talking about him. I would say perhaps Houston.
Yeah, I wonder if that just kind of became a family tradition. It wasn't so much a German thing at that point, more of just a family tradition.
Could be.
Yeah, well, that was a fun thing to talk about.
Well, names are always interesting. It's always something that you wonder about, and often we don't have any information. All we can do is guess about why people went by one name and not another, and often they went by different names throughout their life. Well, let's get to our subject for the day, and this is my great-grandmother, and her name was Mary Margaret Peterson, and she married a man named Charles Cannon Creer. And I titled this blog post that I wrote, this was a 52 Ancestors post, and the prompt was Gone Too Soon. So I wanted to write about Mary because she was gone too soon. She died in her mid-50s, and her oldest daughter was my grandmother, Florence Matilda Creer Kelsey was my grandmother. Mary Margaret died when Florence was expecting her 5th child, and I have a picture of the last family photo. It's in 1925, and it's just sad to think that Mary would miss meeting most of her grandchildren, and her youngest children were pretty little, and so she would miss seeing them grow up, seeing them get married, strike out on their own. So now that I am older, I think, wow, that would have been so sad to have missed out on all of my grandchildren and seeing them grow up, which is so fun. So even though I never got to meet her, we have a lot of stories and photos, and it really sheds light on her life. And I'm also really impressed with what she was able to accomplish in the face of some pretty significant challenges to her life. So Mary was born to Danish immigrants, so she is full Danish, even though she was born in Utah. She was born on 25 April 1871 in Spanish Fork. She was the 3rd child of Soren Peterson and Margaret Matilda Rigtrip. And her parents had each joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Denmark and immigrated to Utah as young people with their families. And in Spanish Fork, they met and got married in 1867 and started their family. Margaret's first daughter, Hannah Matilda, died soon after birth, and then she went on to have a son, Charles, and then my great-grandmother, Mary Margaret, and then she had 7 more children. So as the oldest daughter who survived, Mary must have been a large help to her mother. Sadly, Margaret died on 11 May 1886 after giving birth to her 10th child, Florence Irene. So Mary was only 15 years old at this time, and she lost her mother, and then she had these 7 younger siblings, including a newborn baby. So I can only imagine what that would have been like for her. Then the baby, Florence Irene, died at only 5 months old. So that must have been heartbreaking for this 15-year-old young woman who had likely taken care of this child. She'd lost her mother and then this baby. Wow, I really considered how difficult that would have been. Her father, Soren, married again in 1889, just 3 years later. So the new wife, Mary Frances, probably took over the housekeeping duties and the children, and Mary Margaret was free to start her own family.
All right, let's talk now about Mary Margaret Peterson's marriage and family. So Mary and Charles Cannon Creer were married on March 25th, 1892 in the beautiful Manti Temple in Utah. A wedding reception was held in their honor in the white brick house that Charles had built for his bride. That's pretty unique to know about that. Located across from the city park in Spanish Fork, the 2-story home had a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom downstairs and 2 bedrooms upstairs. The house was enlarged several years later to accommodate their growing family. Mary had 11 children, all born in the white brick house. Mary lost 2 of the children at birth, but she was able to raise 9 of them. She named her first child Florence Matilda after her oldest and youngest sisters, who both died as babies. Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's fun because I actually have a digitized copy of the wedding announcement where it says, "Your presence is requested at the wedding reception of Mary M. Peterson and Charles C. Creer at their residence." So he'd already built this house, and she was going to get to move into quite a nice house. I have been to that house. It's still in Spanish Fork across from the park. And it's just so neat to think that he had the resources and the ability to, whether he built it himself or had help. I would imagine he'd had help. But it's neat to visit that house and think of my grandmother growing up there and the wedding reception that was held there.
So it says on her wedding invitation that her name was Mary Ann Peterson?
Mary M.
Oh.
So Mary Margaret.
Got it. And so she was clearly named after her mother.
Yeah, she was. It's fun to see naming patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Mary had a daughter, Clara, who I always knew as Aunt Cal, and she took a writing class in her later years and wrote all these great stories and histories about her siblings and her parents. So I have all of those, and it's been really neat to be able to draw on those for some of these stories. So she wrote about the accident that shortened Mary's life. After Mother and Dad had been married for about 15 years, she met with a severe accident which rendered her an invalid for the rest of her life. I was about 6 years old when this accident happened, but I remember it well. Father had a dry farm in Thistle Valley. He had taken the family up to the little cabin he had built on the farm. It was only about 15 miles from home, but it took a buggy and a wagon to transport us to and from. Mother became anxious to go home. By the time we had packed up, a storm was approaching. The house was on the top of a hill, and we had to go down a steep dugway to get to the main road. Mother decided to walk down the hill. She took 2 of the children with her and took a shortcut. A stiff wind was behind her. She lost her balance and fell. She broke her kneecap. In those days, the doctors in our town were not too experienced in treating this kind of a wound. They treated her improperly, and bone in her leg decayed. She was taken to a bone specialist in Salt Lake who operated on her 3 times but was unable to correct the situation. She suffered with this pain for 16 years before she died. That is just horrible.
It's really hard to imagine that nowadays when a simple broken kneecap could be fixed so easily.
Yeah, and I actually have a friend who just broke her kneecap, and she'd had both of her knees replaced, and she said the kneecap was way more painful than either of the replacements. So now that I know that, it makes me even feel worse for her that apparently it's just really, really a painful thing to have a broken kneecap.
And that's awful that she had to live with that pain for 16 years and then died so young.
Yeah, she really did have some challenges in her life.
Well, Clara, or Aunt Cal, also wrote about her mother's talents in music and storytelling. What a gem that we have this. She wrote, Mary had 2 exceptional talents. She was very musical and a great storyteller. Her father, Soren Peterson, bought her one of the first organs to Spanish Fork. When she was very young, she showed unusual musical ability and became the organist of several organizations in the church. She was often the accompanist for the leading vocalist in the city. Her instrument was the organ, but she could play the piano well whenever she could. Even though Charles was a farmer, he was the private secretary to his father, William, while he was in the state legislature. His business took him to Salt Lake City once in a while. He kept his business affairs to himself, but he loved to surprise the family with unusual gifts when he came home. On one occasion, he was so excited about a special piece of freight that was coming on the next train. It was a gift and a surprise for Mary. When it arrived, it was in a large crate. The family was all in awe when they saw the biggest and most elegant upright piano they had ever seen. It didn't take Mary long to sit down at the piano and play some of the greatest music they had ever heard. Charles's surprise gift was complete, and Mary's joy was immeasurable. Most of the girls learned to play the piano. Charles brought home a mandolin for Mary to learn to play. This also gave her a lot of enjoyment. From then on, even during the sad times, there was music in the home. Many times she would tell a story with a musical accompaniment. The children could not get enough of this kind of entertainment. As soon as she would finish a piece, they would eagerly say, "Play it again, play it again." She was a great storyteller. She could read a story and retell it in a more interesting way than the original version. She was very creative and had a great imagination. Occasionally, she would tell a story and accompany herself on the piano.
I love to think of her doing that and the family gathered around her. It's fun because I inherited some of her musical talent because I too learned to play the organ young and accompanied in church and still do that to this day. I haven't always done it throughout my life, but that is my current assignment in our church. And I remember when I was little and learning to play the piano, it just came so easily for me. It just was a joy. It was easy. It was definitely a talent. And my grandmother, who was Mary's daughter, would come into our living room and she would just sit there and listen. And I had a book that had all these old-time tunes in it, and I would play those for her, and she just loved it. I thought she must have been thinking about her own childhood when she would sit and listen to her mother play. Probably brought back a lot of memories for her.
Oh, that's so fun. And I love to think of her being so creative and telling stories and making up her own accompaniment on the piano while she's telling stories. What a fun, unique person.
I know. She must have just had that ability to play by ear, which I need music, but if she was making up her own things, can you just imagine how fun that would be? Well, I wish we had a recording. That would just be so neat.
Too bad.
Well, besides this legacy of music, she also left a legacy of sewing. My grandmother Florence learned to sew from Mary, her mother, who dressed her 6 girls impeccably. And usually she had matching dresses for each Easter, Christmas, and the 4th of July. So my grandmother also sewed clothes for her daughters and continued sewing throughout her life. Quilts, pillows, a nightgown for every granddaughter at Christmas, and more. And then my mother also sewed matching dresses for my sister and me, and I continued the tradition by sewing matching dresses for my daughter. Music was a large part of the Creer home, and as I already talked about, I inherited that musical talent for playing the piano and organ. When I got married, my great aunt Clara, which we've also talked about as Aunt Cal, gave me the glass compote that belonged to Mary. And I wish I knew more of the compote story. I have thought that maybe it was a wedding gift or another surprise brought home by Charles. I wrote a whole blog post about it, about honoring your heritage with heirlooms. But it does connect me to my great-grandmother that I never knew. And I feel very honored to have received it because there were a lot of great-grandchildren. And someday I'll pass it on to one of my granddaughters, connecting her to her ancestor. So it's fun because after I wrote this blog post, a reader, Kim Kinsey, has experience in researching china, crystal, and silver. And she researched the compote because I had a picture of it in a previous blog post about this heirloom. And she found out that the compote is the Aurora Clear pattern made by the Brilliant Glasswork Company circa 1888. And so I went to their website and I found a bowl that is almost identical to the compote. So she noted that the company went bankrupt in 1892 and the molds went to the Huntington Glass Company. So there is a fun website called replacement.com that dates this pattern as made between 1888 and 1902. So that might include the Huntington years. But it seems really likely that the compote could have been a wedding gift in 1892. You know, it's just right in that era. So that's really fun. And I do know that my grandmother inherited a bunch of dishes from her mother. Unfortunately, my Aunt Ermy pulled the shelf down that had all the dishes and they all broke. So we don't have any of those dishes. So somehow that compote must have been in a different place. Well, obviously it was in a different place. It wasn't at my grandmother's house. It was at Aunt Cal's home. So thankfully something survived that was handed down to me. So it's pretty neat.
That's so neat that your great aunt Cal gave you that when you got married. How old was Ermy when she knocked all that down?
A child. She was just a child. Oh, if you can imagine. Oh, my poor grandmother. She was living too, and she loved nice things. My grandmother really loved nice things. And she grew up in that beautiful home, you know, that her dad had built. And then she moved up to Idaho and lived literally in a shack, you know, like an 8x10 shack. And so there's a funny story that she brought kind of a nice trousseau in a trunk, and she had some really fancy nightgowns, and the neighbor ladies all thought that they were formal dresses. So, you know, my grandmother left this really kind of nice home, and I think she had a pretty nice growing up, except for the fact that her mother, you know, was incapacitated, and my grandmother, as the oldest child, would have had to take care of the younger children as well, you know, very similar to what her mother went through. Anyway, I love reading the stories and learning and thinking back about what it would have been like for these ancestors.
Yeah, and thanks to Aunt Cal for writing this all down.
And it's really a good lesson for all of us to make sure we write some memories. You know, every child might have a different memory of their growing up, but every single one of those memories is valid and important for our descendants.
So true. Well, thanks everyone for listening as we talk today about Mary Margaret Peterson, our ancestor who died too soon. We hope this gave you some ideas for something you could write about your own family and help preserve the memories of your ancestors for the future.
Right. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.